Today's topic is developing web apps with LampCRM Part 2. In the last video, we loaded VueJS and jQuery using a global config file. The config file uses required.js to specify the respective paths. Now, what I'd like to introduce today is loading a local config file. So for page 1, I've extended it to specify a config file which will load a VueJS component. So the first thing I do is to use a function called requireFormat. You can name it what you like, but its ultimate goal is to remove the .js extension as required.js does not support specifying the full path with the extension. So with the requireFormat, we're able to then pass in a normal path with the extension, apply requireFormat, and required.js will be happy and will be able to parse the path appropriately. Now, you're wondering why go through all this trouble and not just do like this, right? Well, that's because it will not work with LampCRM Web Apps at this point. The issue is that to be able to generate the cache busting and the automatic version substitution, we need the .js extension to identify that this is a JavaScript file and we need to do version substitution. The only two extensions that are supported at this point for cache busting, automatic cache busting, is the .css and .js files. So this is the reason why we have to give it the full path, so the LampCRM engine can actually identify that this is one of the supported files and automatic version substitution gets applied. So now that we have our path, and we've called it sample component, so that's what we will refer to in subsequent files. Now that we have our path, we also have to specify a shim. Now with required.js, what the shim allows you to do, one of the things it allows you to do, which we're using here, is the dependencies, and that's very important. So you can have required.js calls that are nested, and that's actually what I used to do. Nest all the required.js calls, and it became unmanageable. If you specify the dependencies appropriately, then you do not need to nest required.js calls. Required.js will just determine which ones to load first and which ones to load last. So in our case, our VueJS component will specify jQuery and obviously Vue, which was specified in the global config file right here. So if we return to the local one, our config file for the local page is complete. So save that. It requires compilation obviously for ES5, and there are no errors. Just to demonstrate, if we have an error, we use Babel to actually compile in your browser, and your browser will output an error. Here we go. So now that we have our config file, which will specify the correct paths, we need to load it, right? So in our load file, which I have now extended to not only use the global configuration, but also local configuration. So very simply, all I have to do is, instead of specifying the full path to global, we just specify a local file path. So there's no need to specify the whole file path, just specify the file name, because we're in the same folder here, and just apply require.toURL. Require.toURL will then complete the full path, which will be stored in local config, and we can pass it to the first require.js call. Once we have our configuration set, we do a require.js nested call. We're still left with 3 levels of nesting, but it's manageable. So firstly, we load our settings. Secondly, we load our libraries. And with the shim dependencies, we can load them all in one line. And then finally, we'll load our main file. So to refer back to the local config, we require.js it in a comma-separated array. Then we load jQuery, view, sample component, which we've named right here. Require.js knows that sample component depends on view and jQuery, so it will load those 2 libraries first and sample component last. Once we've done that, we load our main file. So we've looked at the config. Let's look at the component. Okay, so the component, as specified before, is a VueJS component. These are the components we support. So we import Vue, obviously, and all you have to specify is view.component, right? View.component. The way we import it in the main file is just by specifying import. You name it whatever you like, as it's the default. We call it sample comp here from sample component. So instead of specifying the full path, again, we can refer right back to this require.js config. The second step in loading a require.js component is to specify the component in the components list. If we look now at the component itself, right here is the component. So we specify view.component, give the component a name, right, which is what you will refer to in your actual HTML. All right here. So this particular element name comes from this view component name. We then specify a template. There needs to be a single root element, so everything is encapsulated in a div element. We're able to have a dynamic class with Vue, so vbind :class and then an array. In this case, we've only got one class variable, but we may have more than one. We also bind to the click action, the onClick, and we execute the change class method, passing in a string, which will actually be the class name. So in the first link, we pass in class bRed, and in the second one, we pass bBlue. Right, so all the method does is writes to the console to make sure it's being executed, and then we refer to this, which is the local component class, which is part of the data here, and we pass it the new class variable value. Now, we probably should initialize component class with an empty string. The next thing we have are computed values. So we've got one computed value, which we'll call class name, and it's only got a get, so it won't amend anything. It will just get a string, and we build the string using interpolation. So ES6 supports interpolation, and we'll look at what it actually does. But with interpolation, we use the backtick, put in a string, then we refer to a variable. In our case, it is the this.component class. So we have $, curly bracket, this.component class, and curly bracket. This will generate a string, and it's just some syntactic sugar that we can use. So let's save that. Oh, one more thing. We haven't referred to the class names, so an easy way to go is just to have a paragraph, use the mustache, class name, and this should replace class name with the string generated. So there's our Vue component ready to go. Let's go back to the main file, which imports the component. And we really didn't have much to do, which was just to import the component and specify it in the components list. We can just briefly go over the CSS that was added. We just added some CSS for the component container. Sorry, some Sass. So this is not quite CSS. As you can see, we have a nested anchor, which is not supported by CSS. It's only supported by a Sass file. It's specified right here. It requires compilation. So the component container, which refers to the main component's root element, component container. Then we have the anchor, which we have a couple of them here. Then we have the dynamic classes, for lack of a better word, which will be applied to the containing component container. So one, all it does is change the background color to blue, and the other one changes the background color to red. So the final addition that we need to make, obviously, is to include the component in the HTML file, and there's nothing simpler than this, which is to write the component name as an element, and that's it. So now if we go and check the page, you will see that the component has been loaded. If we look at what's actually happened, it's actually replaced a component sample with the actual code within the component, the Vue component. So the class name is empty. Remember, we initialized it to an empty string right there. But once we click one of the buttons here, it should be assigned a value, right? Computed values obviously are reactive. So when computed class changes, it will generate a new string automatically. Red class, blue class, and you can see the string changes. So we might change that to white. It's within a paragraph, so we can tell it for paragraphs within the component container. We go color white. Here we go. So that's all there is to it for a Vue component, or let's say a simple Vue component. I may have additional videos to go over passing variables to a component as well as querying an API. But as far as a simple Vue component, that's all there is to it. Thank you for watching. See you next time.